Welcome back. I'm Stephanie Orell, and today I'm going to do a little bit of discussion on what it means to talk about and define trauma. We could talk forever about this topic, so it's really inexhaustible how we think about and talk about trauma. So one thing I want everybody watching this to know is that I have been talking about and researching and being a part of situations that have survivors of trauma for a very long time. I'm very comfortable talking about things that might make an emotional impact on you as you watch the video. You may have heard of or seen before things called trigger warnings. It's sometimes just so easy to talk about for me as a topic of an objective research, where for you it's going to be a subjective reference. And so you may have a response to the things that I'm saying. I think it's really important to be aware of the possibility of having that reaction. And also, as you're watching any kind of social media that's talking about mental health issues, if you have any kind of reaction, that you may need to seek out something for yourself that's soothing as a response. So just to know that you have a reaction, that's perfectly normal. And two, that you have some kind of method to do something to take care of yourself if you do have a reaction. Call a friend, sit with a book, go get a cup of tea, take a walk. Remind yourself primarily, anytime you have a trigger of any kind, of your present reality and that you're safe in that reality. Before we define trauma, I want to back up just a little bit. Trauma has become such a word, it's a hashtag, right? It's been really overgeneralized, probably overused, and there's a danger in that. And the danger in the overuse is that people that are experiencing aspects of trauma or trauma as defined differently across different scholars' works, who really have the remnants of trauma in their lives, I think that when it gets washed out, it becomes easier to disregard as something important for us to pay attention to as a culture, society. I've been thinking about, okay, so then how do we think about trauma in relationship to other human experiences? And I think one way is that human suffering exists, and all of us experience human suffering. All of us experience pain. All of us experience loss. Suffering, loss, pain, those are not equivalent to what it means to say someone has experienced trauma. How do we understand what trauma is? I personally feel very indebted to and aligned with Judith Herman's interpretation of trauma. She recently wrote a book on justice, and her book on trauma and recovery is very popular and well read in the field. So one of the things that she says has to be present in order for something to constitute trauma is a sense of horror and a sense of helplessness, or you could think about it as a sense of pretty deep fear and helplessness. That sets up the scene for having endured a traumatic experience or experiences that then have reverberations in our lives over time. Bruce Perry is another theorist who works with trauma, and he actually distinguishes between what we call big T trauma and little t trauma. So big T trauma is going to be more profound, easily identifiable acts that constitute a traumatic experience. So if somebody's raped, if someone's experienced child abuse, physical and sexual especially, but emotionally also counts, that's a very important aspect of thinking about child abuse. So for instance, if we think about what just happened in Maui, someone who's sitting in the water watching the fire rip through their community, afraid of the potential of their own lives being taken, but also helpless to do anything about what's happening, that's traumatic. How they deal with it afterwards is another aspect of thinking about trauma, but let's stick with this big T, little t trauma. Okay, so little t traumas is conceived of by Perry are incidents that happen over our lifetime that isolated might look like what we would term a microaggression, for instance, but that accumulated start to have the same impact as a big T trauma. So if, for instance, you grew up in a neighborhood where there's violence outside of your door, and every time you're walking outside, you're vigilant, that feeling of fear and helplessness, to go back to Judith Herman's term, that's going to build up, and it starts to create the same kind of effect as a big T trauma. There's lots of different incidences or examples that we can give for these little T traumas. Another one might be being bullied in school continually, where that over time adds up and has the same kind of mental health effects as having a big T trauma.